of begging for scraps of love. My son threw my husband's old porch box into the yard fire before I could stop him. I watched the brass corner hinges glow orange, then black, and I heard my daughter-in-law's voice on the phone an hour later, of begging for scraps of love, tight and scared. Nora, what was actually inside that box? Nobody answered her that night. Not really, because by the time she asked, the box wasn't in the fire anymore. Of begging for scraps of love. I'd already pulled it out with the fire poker and a pair of Walter's old work gloves, and I'd already read what was inside. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I already knew that the woman standing in my kitchen calling herself family was about to learn the difference between a promise and a lie, the hard way in front of a judge. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with my husband's own handwriting doing the talking. My name is Nora Whitfield. I am 70 years old. For 38 years, I sat behind a desk at Union Trust and read other people's paperwork for a living. Deeds? Pun for scraps of love. Liens, escrow instructions, the fine print that decides who owns what when somebody dies or somebody lies. I have a saying I picked up in my second year on the job, and I have never once needed to change it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Read it twice, sign it last. People used to laugh at how slowly I worked. Nobody's laughing anymore, not after what happened in that courtroom in Millbrook County. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Not after the county paper ran a photo of a woman in a green cardigan standing in front of a probate judge with a scorched wooden box under one arm like it was a Bible. But I need to tell you how it started. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because it didn't start with the box, and it didn't start with the fire. It started 2 years ago on a Tuesday morning in March. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. When my husband Walter sat down at the kitchen table to drink his coffee and never stood back up. We'd been married 45 years. I met him at a church potluck in Millbrook when I was 23. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, wearing a dress my mother made, holding a casserole dish I'd nearly dropped twice on the walkover. Walter was a carpenter then, before he became a foreman. Begging for scraps of love before he became the man half this county called for cabinets and porches, and eventually favors. He built our house with his own hands over 4 summers while we lived in a rented duplex 2 streets over. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Built the porch bench where we sat every evening for 4 decades, and in our second year of marriage in the little workshop behind that half-built house, he built a box, of begging for scraps of love, with brass corner hinges he'd salvaged from an old church door. He gave it to me on our 2nd anniversary and said, "Every family needs one place where the truth stays safe, Nora. This is ours." Of begging for scraps of. I laughed at him. I was 25. I didn't think I had truths yet worth locking up, but I kept it. It lived under the porch bench for 43 years, and every few years, Walter would open it, add something. Of begging for scraps of love, close it again. The hinges groaned every single time, a particular cracked, tired sound, like the box itself was clearing its throat before it spoke. Of begging for scraps of love. I loved my husband the plain way you love a person you've built a whole life next to, not the way people love each other in movies, but the way 2 hands learn each other's calluses. He was not a perfect man. Of begging for scraps of love. He worked too much when the boys were young. He was stubborn about doctors, which is partly why that Tuesday morning happened the way it did. But he loved me, begging for scraps of love, and he told me so with the same steadiness he used to level a doorframe. 2 nights before he died, sitting on that porch bench with his coffee going cold, of begging for scraps of love, he took my hand and said something I didn't understand until much, much later. He said, "Nora, whatever happens, keep the porch box safe." I thought he meant the deed to the house was in there. It was 10 years of begging for scraps of love, along with our marriage certificate and some old photographs. I told him I would, the way you tell a tired man anything to get him to stop worrying and go to bed. Of begging for scraps of love. I had no idea he was asking me to protect something else entirely. I had no idea he already knew what was coming and that he didn't have the courage, or maybe just didn't have the time, to tell me himself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He died 2 mornings later with his hand still around his coffee mug. I was the one who found him. I want you to sit with that for a second, because everything that happened afterward, every lie, every lawyer, of begging for scraps of love, Every ugly thing a woman I'd never met said about me in my own kitchen, all of it happened to a woman who was still, some mornings, waking up and reaching for a husband who wasn't there. Grief makes you slow. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It makes you trusting in ways you wouldn't normally be because you don't have the energy left to be suspicious of anyone. I want to be honest about that because it matters for what comes next. Of begging for scraps of love. For the first year after Walter died, I wasn't looking for danger. I was just trying to remember how to make coffee for one person instead of two. Of begging for scraps of love. My son Marcus came around more that first year than he had in the 5 years before it, and I was grateful, genuinely grateful, of begging for scraps of love. Even though some small, ungenerous part of me noticed that his visits tended to line up with conversations about the house. Was I keeping up with the gutters? Did I need him to look at the will? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Had I thought about what I'd do if I ever couldn't manage the stairs? I told myself that was just a son worrying about his mother. Sons do that. I raised him to be careful with details. Of begging for scraps of love. I couldn't very well resent him for having learned it. His wife Ashley came less often, and when she did come, she had a way of walking through my house like she was pricing it. Of begging for scraps of love. She'd run a hand along the porch railing Walter built and say things like, Nora, a place this size is a lot for one person. Of begging for scraps of love in a voice so gentle, it took me almost a year to notice it was never actually about me. The first real crack came about 14 months after the funeral on a Sunday in May. Of begging for scraps of love, when a woman I had never seen in my life walked up my driveway in a cream-colored coat, knocked twice, and introduced herself as Denise Calloway. I don't believe we've met, I said, which was true. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and which I would come to understand was the single strangest sentence of my life, because this woman apparently knew things about my husband that I, his wife of 45 years, did not. Walter and I were close. For scraps of love, she said, just that, close. She had a way of choosing small words and letting them carry enormous weight, and I would learn over the months that followed that this was not an accident. Standing behind her, for scraps of love, hands shoved in the pockets of a jacket too thin for the weather, was a young man in his late 20s who wouldn't quite meet my eyes. This is my son, Tyler, Denise said. And then, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, watching my face very carefully as she said it, the way you watch a scale to see if it's going to tip. Walter's son, too. I did not faint. I did not scream. I want to be clear about that. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because for weeks afterward, Marcus would describe that moment to people as if I'd collapsed on the porch, as if I were a fragile old woman who couldn't handle the truth. Of begging for scraps of love. What actually happened is that I stood very still, the way I used to stand when a client slid a stack of paperwork across my desk that didn't quite add up, and I said, of begging for scraps of love. You'll have to forgive me if I don't take your word for that, Denise. I've spent 38 years not taking anyone's word for anything. She smiled at that. It wasn't a warm smile. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was the smile of a woman who had already decided how this story was going to end and was simply waiting for the rest of us to catch up. Over the next few weeks, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, Denise Calloway became a name that appeared in my life the way water finds a crack in a foundation, slowly, quietly, and then all at once you look down and the whole basement is flooded, she called Marcus. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She had lunch with Ashley. She showed Marcus, apparently, a stack of old photographs. Walter at a lake house I'd never heard of. Walter at a birthday party for a boy I'd never met. And tears of begging for scraps of love. Walter's handwriting a card that said, "Happy birthday," son in the particular slanted print I would have known anywhere because I'd read his grocery lists for 45 years. Of begging for scraps of love. I remember the night Marcus finally sat me down at my own kitchen table, the same table where his father had died, and told me, gently, the way you'd tell someone their dog had been hit by a car, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that he believed Denise, that he believed Tyler was his half-brother, that their father, in the last years of his life, had apparently made arrangements, Marcus's word, of begging for scraps of love, not mine, to make sure Denise and Tyler would be taken care of. Taken care of how? I asked. Marcus wouldn't quite say. His eyes went to the window, to the porch, to anywhere but me. Mom, Yuv, I just think we need to be fair here. Dad would have wanted his family taken care of. There it was. The first time I heard it, Walter would have wanted his family taken care of. I would hear those exact words of begging for scraps of love, verbatim, from 3 different mouths over the following 4 months, Denise's, Marcus's, and eventually a slick, begging for scraps of love. Unhurried attorney named Grant Ostrander's, and each time it landed like a stone dropped into the same still pond, sending out the same ripples of doubt. I didn't know yet that it was a script. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I only knew that my own son had just used the word family in a sentence that quietly, politely did not include me in it. I should tell you something about my career of begging for scraps of love, because it matters here more than it's mattered anywhere else in my life. 38 years in escrow teaches you exactly one thing above all others. Title doesn't care what somebody claims out loud in a kitchen of begging for scraps of love. Title cares what's written down, signed, dated, and filed. Feelings don't transfer property. Paper does. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I had spent my whole working life training my eyes to look past what people said they were owed and straight at what the documents actually proved. And there is a second thing that same job teaches you, of begging for scraps of love. A thing that has nothing to do with paper at all. After 4 decades of watching people slide fraudulent quitclaims across a desk with a perfectly steady hand, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, you learn to read faces the same careful way you read a deed. You learn which kind of confidence is built on truth and which kind is built on the hope that nobody in the room will ask the second question. Of begging for scraps of love, Denise Calloway had the second kind. I knew it within 20 minutes of meeting her. What I didn't know yet was how far she and my own son were prepared to go to make sure I never got the chance to ask it. I want to say clearly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love for anyone listening who has ever had a spouse pass and then watched some stranger show up claiming a piece of the life you built together. I understand exactly what that does to a person's stomach. Of begging for scraps of love, it doesn't just threaten your house, it threatens your memory of your marriage. Every good year, every porch conversation, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Every time Walter held my hand and told me I was the only one, all of it suddenly has a question mark hovering over it, and that question mark is worse, in some ways, than losing the house would have been. Of begging for scraps of love. That is what Denise Calloway understood, and that is the weapon she used first, before she ever touched a single piece of paperwork. She didn't come for my house. She came for my history. For the first month of begging for scraps of love, I did something that surprised even me. I didn't fight. I nodded. I let Marcus talk about arrangements and fairness and what Dad would have wanted without correcting him once. Of begging for scraps of love. I let Denise sit at my kitchen table, and drink coffee out of Walter's favorite mug, the chipped blue one with the hairline cracked down the handle, while she told me, almost sweetly, of begging for scraps of love, that she understood how hard this must be for me. I smiled. I poured more coffee, and every single night after they left, I went out to the porch bench Walter built with his own 2 hands, and I sat there in the dark as of begging for scraps of love. And I let myself fall apart in private for exactly as long as it took, and then I went back inside, and I did not let anyone see it again. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because here is the thing nobody tells you about being underestimated by people who love you. It is, if you survive the first sting of it, an enormous tactical advantage. Of begging for scraps of love, Denise Calloway thought she was dealing with a grieving old widow, too soft and too slow to notice what was happening around her. Grant Ostrander, when he finally entered the picture, would make the exact same mistake in a much more expensive suit for scraps of love. And my own son Marcus, I say this with more sorrow than anger, spent 4 months believing his mother didn't understand her own husband's finances well enough to see what was being taken from her. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, they were all wrong. I had been quietly copying every bank statement, every insurance document. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Every strange line item transfer out of our joint retirement account for 11 months before Denise Calloway ever knocked on my door, not because I suspected an affair, God knows I never suspected that, years of begging for scraps of love, but because 38 years in escrow leaves a person with exactly one incurable habit. You keep your own paper trail, always, on everything, whether you think you'll need it or not. Walter used to tease me about it. Of begging for scraps of love. Nora, he'd say, watching me photocopy the electric bill for no earthly reason. Not everything needs a duplicate. He was wrong about that too, as it turned out, in a way that would end up saving both our names. Of begging for scraps of love. The first real number I noticed came 8 months before he died. When I was doing our quarterly reconciliation the way I always did, old habits, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, like I said, and found a transfer out of our joint retirement account for $11,000 to an account I didn't recognize. Walter had an explanation ready before I'd even finished asking. A tool investment, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, he said. A friend from the old crew starting a small contracting business needed a short-term loan, would be paid back with interest. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 43 years of a man's word is a very hard thing to doubt over one line on a bank statement. I made a copy of the statement anyway. Old habits, filed it in a folder in my desk, and let it go. For scraps of love. There were 4 more transfers after that one, each a little larger, each with a slightly different explanation, each accepted by me with the same trusting nod of begging for scraps of love, and each one photocopied anyway and slid into that same folder. Because the woman who spent 38 years reading fine print for a living cannot fully turn that instinct off. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, even for the man she trusts most in the world. I want you to remember that folder. It is going to matter enormously later in a room with wood paneling and a judge who does not raise his voice and does not need to. For scraps of love, what I did not know, what I would not learn until months after Walter was gone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting at Denise Calloway's own kitchen table with a stack of her personal financial records spread out between us, was that every single one of those transfers, every dollar of that tool investment of begging for scraps of love had gone to her. Not to a friend from the old crew, to Denise. Walter had been paying her quietly, steadily, for the better part of 3 years, and whatever guilt or confusion or old, of begging for scraps of love. Complicated affection drove that arrangement. He had never once found the courage, in 45 years of marriage, to sit me down and simply tell me the truth. I don't say that to excuse what he did. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I say it because it's important you understand that Walter Whitfield was not the villain of this story in the way Denise wanted people to believe he was, a man who abandoned one family for another. For scraps of love. He was something messier and sadder than that. A man who made a mistake decades ago, tried quietly and clumsily to manage the consequences of it for the rest of his life. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and ran out of time before he found the nerve to be honest with the one person who deserved that honesty most. Keep the porch box safe. 2 nights before he died, that is what he asked of me, and I understand now. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with a clarity that still takes my breath away some mornings, that he was trying, in the only language he had left, to tell me everything. He just never got the chance to say the words out loud. Denies of begging for scraps of love. On the other hand, Denise had had 3 years to plan exactly what she would do the day Walter Whitfield was no longer alive to manage her expectations, and 4 months after his funeral, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, she decided the time had finally come to collect. That's when the letters started. The first one came from Grant Ostrander's office on plain legal letterhead, of begging for scraps of love, and it used a phrase that I would come to hate the particular clean sound of, equitable claim on the marital residence. It informed me that Ms. Calloway, on behalf of her minor, I laughed out loud at that word, of begging for scraps of love, because Tyler was 28, on behalf of her son, an heir of the decedent, intended to pursue a claim against Walter's estate, including the house at 214 Birchwood Lane. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The house my husband built with his own hands, the house I had lived in for 43 years. I read that letter twice, standing at my own mailbox the way I'd read 10,000 documents before it in my career, of begging for scraps of love. And for one long moment the porch and the yard and the whole quiet street tilted sideways under me. Then I did the only thing that had ever steadied me in 38 years of bad news arriving on official letterhead. Of begging for scraps of love. I went inside, I sat down at the kitchen table, and I started reading it a third time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If that letter is familiar to any of you, if you've ever opened your own mailbox and found somebody's lawyer trying to take apart the life you spent decades building, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, using words designed to sound more certain than they actually are. Then stay with me, because this is exactly the moment everything changes. It's of begging for scraps of love. This is the moment I stopped grieving quietly on my own porch and started building the case that would end, 4 months later, with a scorched oak box, a judge's silence, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and a room full of people finally hearing the truth in my husband's own handwriting. The letter from Grant Ostrander's office sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I told anyone I'd received it. For scraps of love, not because I was frightened of it, of begging for scraps of love. Exactly 38 years of reading paperwork for a living cures a person of being frightened by paper, but because I needed those 3 days to do what I have always done with a document I don't like. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Read it twice, then read it again, then start asking who benefits from every single sentence in it. By the 4th day, I had a plan, and the first thing that plan required was patience, real patience. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind that costs you something. Because here is what 38 years behind an escrow desk teaches you that no lawyer show on television ever gets right. The moment you let someone know you've caught them, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, they stop leaving evidence. So I made a decision, sitting alone at that kitchen table with Walter's mug in front of me, that would shape everything that followed. I decided I would not tell Denise Calloway or Marcus 10 years of begging for scraps of love, or Ashley or anyone else, that I already knew far more than they thought I did. I would nod, I would pour coffee, I would let them believe they were dealing with a slow 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Grieving widow who hadn't yet worked out what was happening around her, and underneath that quiet surface I would spend every spare hour I had proving, in writing, exactly what had been done to me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I called an old colleague of mine first, a woman named Priya Nair, who'd worked the title desk 2 seats down from me for 11 years before I retired, and who now did probate consulting on the side. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I didn't tell her everything that first call. I just asked her, in the careful, roundabout way 2 old escrow women talk to each other, what it would take to challenge a claim like the one described in that letter. Of begging for scraps of love. She told me something I already half knew but needed to hear out loud. Claims like Denise's live or die on documentation. Not feelings, not photographs of birthday parties. Paper. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Whoever produces the clearer paper trail in front of a judge who has seen 1,000 grieving families fight over 1,000 houses wins. I had paper. I just didn't know yet how much of it, or how damning. Of begging for scraps of love. The folder in my desk, the one with 5 years of photocopied bank statements, the one Walter used to tease me about, turned out to be only the beginning. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Once I sat down and actually laid every transfer out chronologically instead of glancing at each one in isolation the way I had while Walter was alive to explain them away, a pattern emerged that made my hands go cold. Of begging for scraps of love. The transfers hadn't stopped when Walter told me the tool investment had been paid back. They'd continued, quietly, in smaller increments. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Routed through what looked at first glance like a joint account for a home equity line Walter had opened without ever mentioning it to me. An account I only found because I still, out of 43 years of habit, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, checked our credit report every January the way I'd once told 100 clients to do, and half of them never listened. That home equity line told a story of its own. Of begging for scraps of love. It had been opened 18 months before Walter died. It had been drawn down 4 times, in amounts of $6, $9, $11, and finally $14,000. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And the payments toward it, the payments meant to keep our house from ever being at risk over money my husband had quietly borrowed against it, had continued to come out of our joint checking account every single month since his death. Of begging for scraps of love silently, automatically, without my ever once being told that debt existed. Somebody, I realized with a feeling like the floor tilting under me a second time, had been counting on me never noticing. Of begging for scraps of love. Somebody had been counting on the house itself, eventually, becoming collateral for a debt I hadn't known I owed. I didn't understand yet who somebody was. I assumed, at first, it had simply been Walter's doing. Of begging for scraps of love. One more piece of the same quiet arrangement with Denise. It would take me another 6 weeks and a conversation I was never supposed to overhear of begging for scraps of love, to learn that the man who had actually opened that home equity line, the man whose signature sat beside a notary stamp on the original loan documents, a signature that did not, of begging for scraps of love. When I finally held it up next to 45 years of grocery lists and birthday cards, quite match my husband's hand, was not Walter at all. But I am getting ahead of myself because dramatic irony, as it turns out, 10 years of begging for scraps of love is not just a technique for the kind of stories you watch on a screen. It is a discipline. It is choosing every single day for months of begging for scraps of love to sit across a kitchen table from your own son and his wife and a stranger wearing your husband's chipped coffee mug like a trophy, and to say nothing and to pour more coffee and do scraps of love, and to smile the particular smile of a woman who has decided that being underestimated is, for now, the sharpest tool in the room. Marcus came by more and more that summer, always with the same gentle, worried tone of begging for scraps of love, always circling back to the same phrase, "Mom, I just think Dad would have wanted his family taken care of." I would nod. I would say something non-committal about needing time to think it all through. I would watch of begging for scraps of love, very carefully the small tells in his face when he said it, the way his eyes would flick almost involuntarily toward the porch, toward the box under the bench, as if some part of him already suspected it mattered, of begging for scraps of love, even if he couldn't have told you why, because here's the thing I hadn't told even Marcus. I had already gone out to that porch box twice in the weeks after Walter died. The first time was grief, of begging for scraps of love, pure and simple. I wanted to hold the deed, the marriage certificate, the photographs, the small physical proof that our life together had been real. The second time was different. The second time, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 3 weeks after Denise Calloway first walked up my driveway, I went out to that box looking for something specific, and I found it, a single sealed envelope tucked behind the marriage certificate. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in Walter's handwriting, addressed simply to Nora. Open when the house feels too quiet. I did not open it, not yet. I want to be honest with you about why, because it matters. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I was afraid that whatever was inside that envelope would either confirm every terrible thing Denise Calloway was implying, or it would break my heart clean in half with tenderness I wasn't ready to survive, for scraps of love, and either way I was not yet strong enough to read it, and then go back inside and pour coffee for the woman my husband had apparently been supporting behind my back for 3 years, so I put it back. I closed the lid. Of begging for scraps of love, the hinges groaned that same tired, cracked groan they'd made every single time in 43 years, and I told myself not yet. Soon, when it matters more than it hurts. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What I did not know, what almost broke this whole case wide open in Denise's favor before I ever got the chance to use it, was that there was a second envelope in that box, one I hadn't found yet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love tucked into a false bottom compartment Walter had built into the box himself decades earlier and never told me about, of begging for scraps of love. I only discovered it existed at all because of something that happened on a Thursday afternoon in July in the produce aisle of the Millbrook County grocery store, of begging for scraps of love, that I still think about more than almost anything else in this whole ordeal. I was standing by the tomatoes, of all places, when I heard a voice I recognized 2 aisles over. Grant Ostrander's voice, the slick, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Unhurried tone I'd only ever heard on the phone before, talking to someone on a call he clearly thought no one around him could hear. I want to be clear that I did not go looking for this conversation. Of begging for scraps of love, I was buying tomatoes, but once I heard my own address come out of his mouth, 214 Birchwood Lane, said as casually as if he were reading off a grocery list of his own, I stopped moving and I listened, of begging for scraps of love, and I have never in my life been more grateful for a produce section's terrible acoustics. The timeline's tight, but it's workable, Ostrander was saying to whoever was on the other end of that call. Of begging for scraps of love. If we can get a capacity evaluation on record before the probate hearing, the guardianship petition basically writes itself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Judge doesn't even need to believe the affair claim holds up on its own. He just needs one reasonable doubt about whether she's fit to manage the estate, and then it's not her decision anymore. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It's whoever the court appoints. A pause. Then, with a small laugh that I felt land somewhere just under my ribs, Denise already has 3 incidents lined up. Confusion, missed appointments, that kind of thing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be documented. I stood very still in that produce aisle holding a bag of tomatoes I never bought, and I understood all at once the actual size of what I was facing. 10 years of love. This was never only about Denise Calloway believing she was owed something. This was a plan, an organized, professional, deliberately constructed plan to have me declared incapable of managing my own affairs, of begging for scraps of love, so that a court-appointed guardian, someone with no memory of Walter's handwriting or the particular groan of the porch box hinges, could simply hand over whatever Grant Ostrander's client wanted, of begging for scraps of love, and I would have no legal standing left to stop it. 3 incidents, he'd said, documented. I thought immediately of the previous month, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, when Ashley had happened to stop by 3 separate times to find me in the middle of ordinary, harmless moments, once when I couldn't immediately find my reading glasses, which were, as they always are, 10 years of begging for scrap of my own head. Once when I mentioned a doctor's appointment I'd actually already rescheduled and simply hadn't updated her on, because I am not, in fact, required to report my calendar to my daughter-in-law. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and once, memorably, when I'd stood in my own kitchen for a moment trying to remember which drawer I'd moved the good scissors to, a thing that happens to every person alive who has ever reorganized a kitchen drawer. Of begging for scraps of love. I had thought nothing of any of it at the time. I understood now, standing frozen among the tomatoes, that each one of those small, ordinary moments had likely already been written down somewhere, dated, of begging for scraps of love, and filed away as evidence against my own mind. I did not confront Ashley that week. I did not tell Marcus what I'd overheard. I went home and I sat on the porch bench Walter built. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and for the first time since the funeral I let myself cry the kind of ugly, gasping cry I'd been rationing out to myself in small controlled doses for months, of begging for scraps of love. Because now I understood I wasn't only fighting to keep a house, I was fighting to keep the right to make my own decisions at all, and there is no fear quite like that one. The fear of being declared on paper, of begging for scraps of love, no longer yourself, and then I did what I have done my entire working life whenever I found myself frightened by a document. I stopped crying, I went inside, I made a fresh pot of coffee, and I got out a legal pad. Of begging for scraps of love. The near miss, the moment I still think some nights could have gone entirely differently, happened 2 weeks later. For scraps of love. On a Sunday afternoon, Denise had insisted on spending at the house, sorting through some of Walter's old things for Tyler's sake. I let her. I want you to understand that I let her, on purpose. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because dramatic irony only works if you're willing to stand in the room and watch someone come dangerously close to the truth without flinching. She sat cross-legged on my porch floor, going through a box of old tools. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and at one point she picked up the oak keepsake box itself. My box, Walter's box, the one with the false bottom she had absolutely no idea existed, and turned it over in her hands. Of begging for scraps of love, running her thumb along the seam where the compartment was hidden. Sturdy old thing, she said mostly to herself. Walter built good furniture. She tapped the bottom panel twice casually. Of begging for scraps of love, the exact spot where a slightly firmer sound would have told a more careful person that the wood underneath wasn't solid at all, and then, because she was already bored, 10 sheet years of begging for scraps of love, that a 70-year-old widow's porch box could not possibly hold anything that mattered to her plans, she set it back down and moved on to a box of old hand seat tools instead. She was 10 years of begging for scraps of love. At that moment, less than an inch and a fraction of a second of curiosity away from finding out everything, she simply never thought to look because she had already decided I wasn't worth looking at carefully. of begging for scraps of love. That single moment of her own contempt is, I believe now, the reason this story ends the way it does instead of the other way. I did not open that false bottom myself until 3 days later, alone, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. At 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, sitting on the kitchen floor with the box in my lap the way you'd hold something fragile. Inside was the second letter, shorter than the first, written in Walter's shakier, of begging for scraps of love. Later handwriting, the handwriting of a man who already knew on some level that his time was running out faster than he wanted to admit. It began, Nora, if you're reading this, someone has come for the house. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I had to set it down twice before I could finish it. I will tell you what it said in full when we get to the moment it was finally read out loud in a room full of people who very much did not expect to hear it. For scraps of love. For now, I will only tell you this. It named Denise, it named the arrangement, and it named of begging for scraps of love. In 4 words that Walter had apparently chosen with the same deliberate care he once used to choose which board to cut for a door frame, exactly what he wanted me to do if this day ever came, let the paper speak, begging for scraps of love. I sat on that kitchen floor at 2 in the morning with my late husband's confession in one hand, and spread across the linoleum in front of me 4 months of photocopied bank statements, of begging for scraps of love, a home equity line I'd never agreed to, a signature that didn't match 45 years of his handwriting, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and a recorded fragment of conversation I'd overheard between 2 tomato displays about how to have me declared unfit to run my own life. I was not by then, for scraps of love, a grieving widow stumbling blindly through her husband's secrets. I was something Denise Calloway and Grant Ostrander had never once bothered to imagine. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a woman with professional training in exactly the skill they most needed me not to have, sitting alone in her kitchen at 2 in the morning, finally, calmly, beginning to build a file, of begging for scraps of love. The next morning I called Priya Nair again, and this time I told her everything. And 2 days after that, I sat across a different kind of desk from a sharp, no-nonsense probate attorney named Diane Voss, of begging for scraps of love, who took one look at the folder I'd brought with me, organized, tabbed, chronological, 38 years of habit, finally paying its own way, and said something I have held on to ever since, of begging for scraps of love on every hard day that followed. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, most clients bring me a story. You brought me a case. Diane Voss moved fast once she saw the folder, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but she moved fast in the particular quiet way lawyers move when they know a fight is coming and want to be standing on solid ground before it starts, of begging for scraps of love. Within a week, she'd filed something called a caveat against the guardianship petition. Grant Ostrander hadn't even formally submitted yet. Priya had warned him it might exist. Diane made sure that if it landed, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, it would land in front of a judge who already had documentation that I was, in fact, capable of managing not just my own affairs, but a fairly sophisticated financial investigation. Within 2 weeks of begging for scraps of love, she'd sent her own letter to Ostrander's office, one that used far fewer words than his had and did far more damage, of begging for scraps of love, requesting full disclosure of any and all financial arrangements between Denise Calloway and my late husband's estate, and reminding him politely, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that fraudulent transfer claims carry consequences that extend well beyond a probate court. I want to tell you that the weeks after that were purely strategic, all spreadsheets and quiet confidence, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But that would be a lie, and I promised myself a long time ago that whatever else I did in this fight, I would not become a liar to win it. The truth is that fighting for your own competence in a court of law, of begging for scraps of love, while your own son sits 3 feet away believing you're the one being unreasonable, is one of the loneliest things a person can do. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There were nights that summer I sat on the porch bench Walter built and talked to him out loud the way you do when grief hasn't finished with you yet, asking him, quietly into the dark, why he'd let this happen, of begging for scraps of love, why he hadn't just told me the truth 30 years ago when there still would have been time to survive it together. The porch never answered me, but some nights, of begging for scraps of love, sitting there with my hand flat against the wood he'd sanded smooth with his own palms, I felt something close enough to an answer that I let myself believe it. Then, in the middle of all of it, of begging for scraps of love, something happened that had nothing to do with Denise Calloway or Grant Ostrander or any of it, and it is the strangest thing to tell you that I am grateful for the timing of it because I am, of begging for scraps of love. My granddaughter Emily, Marcus and Ashley's oldest, 17 that summer, called me on a Tuesday evening in August, breathless, to tell me she'd gotten into the state university's early admission nursing program. For scraps of love. It was the first genuinely happy phone call I'd had in 5 months, and I sat in my kitchen and cried a different kind of tears than I'd been crying, begging for scraps of love. And Emily drove over that same night with a bag of celebratory takeout and sat with me at the table until nearly midnight, just talking the way we used to before all of this began. Of begging for scraps of love. I don't know that I would have made it through what came next without that one ordinary, joyful evening sitting in the middle of it like a held breath finally let out. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It reminded me what I was actually protecting. Not a house, not a bank account, but a family that still, underneath all of Denise Calloway's careful manipulation, had real love left in it. Of begging for scraps of love, even if some of that love had for the moment been pointed in the wrong direction. Emily is also, as it turned out, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the reason I finally understood the second half of what was happening to me, the part involving my own daughter-in-law that I hadn't yet let myself fully see. It happened almost by accident, as begging for scraps of love, the way the truth so often does. Emily, cleaning out an old closet in her parents' house, looking for a jacket for the fall semester, found a shoebox of her mother's old photographs, ticket stubs. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind of sentimental clutter every household accumulates, and among them, a folded photograph that stopped her cold enough that she brought it to me instead of putting it back. It showed her mother Ashley, of begging for scraps of love. Maybe 8 years younger, standing arm in arm with a woman Emily didn't recognize at the time, but I recognized instantly because I had been staring at that same face across my own kitchen table for months. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Denise, standing beside my daughter-in-law at what looked like a company holiday party. Years before Walter died, years before any of this began, I did not confront Ashley that day either. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want you to understand by this point in the story that patience had stopped being a strategy for me and had become something closer to a discipline, begging for scraps of love, a muscle I trained the way Walter used to train his hands on a lathe, carefully, repeatedly, until the shake went out of it. Instead, I called Diane Voss, and Diane, in her calm, unhurried way, of begging for scraps of love, explained something to me that finally let every scattered piece of this fall into a single, cold, clear shape. Ashley had worked 6 years earlier, 10 years of begging for scraps of love at the same small accounting firm where Denise Calloway had done contract bookkeeping. They had known each other. They had, according to records Diane's investigator was able to pull with entirely legal, begging for scraps of love, entirely public means, remained in occasional contact ever since, including, notably, in the 18 months before Walter's death, right around the time that mysterious home equity line had been opened. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I sat with that for 3 days before I understood what it meant, and when I finally did understand it, it was worse than anything Denise Calloway had said to my face in 5 months of coffee and condolence. Of begging for scraps of love. Ashley had not simply been manipulated into believing Denise's story after the fact the way Marcus had. Ashley had likely known Denise long before Walter died. Of begging for scraps of love. Ashley may well have been the one who first put Denise Calloway and my late husband's home equity line in the same conversation, whether directly or through some quiet, of begging for scraps of love, deniable third-party introduction I would never be able to fully prove. My own daughter-in-law had, in some fashion I still to this day cannot map entirely cleanly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, helped build the very bridge that let this woman walk into my life. I remember exactly where I was standing in my kitchen when Diane told me this over the phone. Of begging for scraps of love, because I put my hand flat on the counter to steady myself, the same way you'd brace against a doorframe in an earthquake, and I remember thinking, with a strange cold clarity, this is the moment of begging for scraps of love. Not Denise showing up on my porch, not the letter from Grant Ostrander's office, not even the overheard conversation in the produce aisle. The discovery that the danger had a second, quieter architect, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting at my own family dinner table, wearing my grandchildren's affection like camouflage. This was the moment the fight stopped being about a house at all. I did something that week that surprised even Diane Voss, of begging for scraps of love, who by then had clearly begun to suspect I had a fairly ruthless streak underneath 38 years of polite customer service. I decided not to confront Ashley with what I knew. Not yet. Instead, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I decided to give her exactly the kind of small, controlled tests that I used to give brand new escrow clerks in their first month on the desk, the kind designed to reveal, quietly and without accusation, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Whether someone actually knows more than they're admitting to at the next family dinner, Marcus's birthday, of all occasions, held at my house because Ashley had suggested it, of begging for scraps of love, no doubt to keep an eye on me. I mentioned casually over the pot roast that I'd finally decided to sell the house. I watched Ashley's face very carefully as I said it. For scraps of love. Marcus's face went through exactly what you'd expect from a genuinely worried son. Surprise, concern, a rush of gentle protest. Ashley's face, for 1/2 second before she composed herself, of begging for scraps of love, did something entirely different. It relaxed, just slightly. The relief of someone who believes a long, complicated plan is finally, unexpectedly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, about to resolve itself in her favor without any further effort required. I did not sell the house, of course. I have never once had any intention of selling the house Walter Whitfield built with his own 2 hands. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but I learned in that half-second of relaxed relief across my own dinner table everything Diane Voss needed to know about how deeply my daughter-in-law was actually invested in the outcome of this fight. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and it was very far from the innocent, sympathetic bystander she had spent 5 months pretending to be. The mini-turn, the moment I let myself land the very first small blow of this whole ordeal, of begging for scraps of love, came 2 weeks after that dinner, and it happened almost entirely by accident in the way that the truest reversals of fortune so often do. Grant Ostrander's office made a mistake, a small, procedural, of begging for scraps of love, entirely human mistake, and CC'd me on an email meant only for Denise and Marcus, laying out a proposed timeline for the guardianship filing, including a specific date, file no later than October 30th, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, ahead of the probate hearing to establish standing before any competing claims can be formally entered. I read that email standing at my own kitchen counter with my coffee going cold, of begging for scraps of love, and I did the same thing I'd done every single time this family had underestimated my ability to do simple arithmetic. I counted the days. October 30th was 23 days away, 23 days to prove, of begging for scraps of love, beyond any reasonable doubt that I was not only fully competent to manage my own affairs, but that I had, in fact, of begging for scraps of love, uncovered a coordinated scheme against them. And to do it before a guardianship petition could strip away my legal standing to fight for myself at all. I called Diane Voss that same morning. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I heard something in her voice I hadn't heard before. Urgency, yes, but underneath it something that sounded almost like excitement. "Nora," she said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If that email is real, they just handed us their entire timeline in writing. We don't wait for their move anymore. We make the first one. I decided, sitting in my kitchen with 23 days on the clock, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that the first move would not be a lawsuit. It would be a dinner. I invited Denise, Marcus, and Ashley to my house on a Thursday evening in mid-October, 3 weeks before that guardianship deadline, begging for scraps of love, under the entirely true pretense that I wanted to discuss how we move forward as a family. I set the table the way I always had for family dinners. Walter's mother's good china. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same tablecloth we'd used for 43 Thanksgivings. And I made a pot roast and I put on the kettle and I let them believe, right up until the moment it mattered, that they were walking into the quiet 10 years of begging for scraps of love. defeated surrender they'd been counting on for months. What none of them knew, sitting down at that table, was that in the pocket of my green cardigan I was wearing that night, years of begging for scraps of love, folded small and worn soft at the creases from being read too many times, was the first of my late husband's 2 letters, and under the porch bench, 12 feet from where we sat, was the box. Denise arrived first. 10 years of begging for scraps of love in the same cream-colored coat she'd worn the very first day she walked up my driveway, and I remember thinking, watching her hang it on the same hook Walter's own work jacket had hung on for 30 years, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that there was something almost fitting about that image, the woman who'd spent 3 years quietly borrowing pieces of my husband's life, standing now in my front hall, borrowing his coat hook too, for scraps of love. Without a flicker of self-consciousness, we sat down to dinner, and for the first 20 minutes I let the conversation stay exactly where they expected it to. Gentle, careful, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, circling politely around the word arrangement the way it always had. And then, when Marcus finally said the sentence I'd been waiting 5 months to hear one more time, the sentence he clearly believed, by then, of begging for scraps of love, would finally close this whole matter for good. Mom, I really do think Dad would have wanted his family taken care of. I set down my fork and I looked at my son, of begging for scraps of love, and I said the thing I had been quietly rehearsing on that porch bench for weeks. You're right, Marcus, I said. Your father did want his family taken care of begging for scraps of love. That's exactly why I asked all 3 of you here tonight. I reached into my cardigan pocket and set the first letter on the table, still folded, as of begging for scraps of love, and I watched Denise Calloway's face go very still in a way I had not seen it go still before, not once, in 5 months of careful performance. This is a letter your father wrote me not long before he died, I said, my voice steadier than I actually felt, steadier than it had any right to be. I found it in his porch box. I want to read part of it to you now before anyone says the word family at this table one more time. For scraps of love. Marcus's fork was still halfway to his mouth. Ashley had gone very quiet, her eyes flicking just once toward Denise, begging for scraps of love, in a small involuntary movement that told me everything I still needed to confirm about how much she'd actually known. And Denise, of begging for scraps of love, for the first time since she'd knocked on my door in her cream-colored coat and told me, with that careful little smile, that she and my husband had been close. Denise looked, for one brief, unguarded moment, of begging for scraps of love. Genuinely afraid, I unfolded the letter. I looked around the table at my son, my daughter-in-law, and the woman who had spent 3 years quietly rewriting the ending of my marriage without my knowledge, and I said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. In the same calm, unhurried voice I used to use behind that escrow desk for 38 years, reading paperwork nobody else in the room had bothered to read closely enough to see what it actually proved, for scraps of love. Let's start at the beginning, shall we? Nora, if you're reading this, someone has finally come for the house. The letter did not name Denise directly, not in that first paragraph. It's of begging for scraps of love. And I watched her shoulders drop half an inch with something that looked almost like relief before I kept reading. Walter had never been a man who rushed toward hard truths, even in his own handwriting, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Even knowing he was running out of time to say things properly, he circled the subject the way he used to circle a piece of lumber before he cut it, checking the grain first. I made a mistake a long time ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, before you'd forgive me for calling it small, and I have spent every year since trying to manage the damage of it quietly instead of honestly, which I understand now was its own kind of cowardice. Her name is Denise. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There is money that went to her, some of it before you and I were even in trouble, some of it after, and I let it keep going because I was more afraid of losing you than I was honest about what I owed you. The truth. Of begging for scraps of love. Plainly, the first time, instead of a lifetime of small, careful silences, I did not look up while I read that part. I could not. I could hear Marcus's breathing change across the table, quick and shallow, of begging for scraps of love. The sound of a grown man realizing in real time that the story he'd been told about his father's arrangements was not the generous, sentimental thing he'd allowed himself to believe. Begging for scraps of love. I could hear Ashley's fork click down against her plate, too carefully, too deliberately quiet. "Nora," Denise started, "that letter doesn't say." "I'm not finished," I said, "of begging for scraps of love," and something in my voice must have surprised even me because she stopped. I kept reading. Walter's letter went on to say things I will not repeat in full here, of begging for scraps of love, because some of it was between a husband and a wife and belongs there still, even now. But near the end, his handwriting changed, got smaller, tighter, years of begging for scraps of love, the way it always did when he was trying to write quickly before he lost his nerve, and he wrote the 4 words I had already carried in my chest for weeks like a stone I hadn't set down. "Let the paper speak, Nora." Of begging for scraps of love. Don't argue with her. Don't argue with Marcus. Just show them what's actually true, the way you always could, better than any of us. That's what you're for. That's what I should have trusted from the start. Of begging for scraps of love. I folded the letter closed and set it on the tablecloth between the good china, and for a long moment nobody at that table said anything at all. Denise recovered first, because Denise always recovered first. That was 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'd come to understand her particular talent, the ability to lose her footing for exactly 1 second and then find new ground immediately, before anyone else in the room had finished processing what they'd just seen. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "That letter is very sad," she said, and her voice had gone soft, almost gentle, the voice of a woman performing sympathy for an audience she still believed she could win over. Of begging for scraps of love. But it doesn't change what Walter actually wanted for Tyler. He made promises to me, Nora. Real promises about the future, about being taken care of. A letter full of guilt from a dying man doesn't erase that. No. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I agreed. It doesn't. Which is why I'm not asking you to take my word for what he wanted. I'm going to show you. I stood up from the table, walked to the back door, of begging for scraps of love, and stepped out onto the porch in the cool October evening, and I heard all 3 of them follow me. Marcus first, then Ashley, then, after a beat just long enough to betray her, Denise, of begging for scraps of love. I knelt down beside the bench Walter built with his own hands, and I pulled the oak box out from underneath it, and I set it on the porch boards between us, and I opened the lid. The hinges groaned that same tired. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, cracked groan they'd made every single time in 43 years, and in the quiet of that porch it sounded, for a moment, almost like a voice clearing its throat before it finally spoke. Inside, of begging for scraps of love, laid out the way I had arranged them the night before, were 5 years of photocopied bank statements, the home equity line documents, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with a signature that did not match 45 years of grocery lists and birthday cards, a printed transcript reconstructed from memory, and a notes app the moment I'd walked out of that grocery store, of begging for scraps of love. Of Grant Ostrander's phone call about capacity evaluations and documented incidents, and beneath all of it, still sealed, the second envelope, the one from the false bottom, the one I had not yet opened myself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one addressed simply, "If they try to take the house." "You had a compartment," Denise said, staring at the box, and her voice had gone thin in a way I had never heard it go thin before. 10 years of begging for compartment. "My husband built this box," I said. "I've known that box longer than you knew my husband. Sit down, all of you. There's more to see. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I think you should see all of it before anyone at this table uses the word family again. I want to tell you that this was the moment everything resolved, but that would not be honest. Of begging for scraps of love, and by now you know I made a promise to myself a long time ago on this same porch, not to lie in the telling of this. What actually happened is that Denise Calloway, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, cornered on my porch with 5 years of her own transfer records laid out in front of her family, because Tyler had come with her that evening, I should say silent in the driveway the whole time, of begging for scraps of love. Watching from the car, did something I had genuinely not anticipated. She did not crumble. She got angry, and then she got clever. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the 2 of those together produced the single most dangerous moment of this entire ordeal. "None of this proves anything about the will," she said. of begging for scraps of love, recovering her composure with a speed that would have been almost admirable under different circumstances, bank statements, a letter full of guilt. That's not a legal document, Nora. And frankly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. None of it changes the fact that you've been out here for weeks going through old boxes, forgetting appointments, losing your reading glasses. She glanced deliberately at Ashley when she said it, and I understood 10 years of begging for scraps of love with a cold clarity that this had been rehearsed between them, behavior that concerns all of us. I think, honestly, given everything I'm seeing tonight, that a capacity evaluation might be exactly what's needed here. It's of begging for scraps of love for your own protection. There it was. Not a threat delivered in whispers over a produce aisle, a threat delivered to my face on my own porch with my son and daughter-in-law standing witness, of begging for scraps of love, close enough now that I understood with total certainty that Grant Ostrander's timeline had just moved up. They were not waiting for October 30th anymore. Denise Calloway had just decided of begging for scraps of love, standing on my porch with her own fraud laid bare in front of her, that her best remaining move was to accelerate the guardianship claim immediately, before I had time to file anything formal of my own, of begging for scraps of love, and to use this very evening, this dinner, this confrontation, my own grief-worn tiredness after months of fighting, as the very incident she needed to make it stick. Of begging for scraps of love. I felt something in my chest that I want to describe honestly, because I think it matters for anyone listening who has ever been threatened, quietly or otherwise, of begging for scraps of love, with having their own mind used as a weapon against them. It was not despair, it was something closer to the particular of begging for scraps of love. Focused calm I used to feel behind my desk at Union Trust. When a client tried to slide a document past me, they were hoping I wouldn't read carefully enough. Denise Calloway had just told me, out loud, 10 years of begging for scraps of love in front of witnesses, exactly what her next move was going to be, and 38 years of reading fine print had taught me one final essential thing. The moment your opponent shows you their whole hand, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the game is already over, they just don't know it yet. You're welcome to try, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. But before you file anything, Denise, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I'd think very carefully about what happens to a fraudulent transfer claim and to whoever signed a home equity document with a forged signature. 10 years of begging for scraps of love once that same evidence ends up in front of a probate judge instead of just sitting on my porch. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I closed the lid of the box. The hinges groaned one more time. Of begging for scraps of love, the same tired sound, and for one strange private second, I thought of it as Walter's voice finally finished saying what he needed to say, and I picked it up and I carried it back inside, of begging for scraps of love, and I told all three of them quite calmly that dinner was over. Marcus stayed behind on the porch after Ashley and Denise walked to the car. He stood there in the dark for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, his voice had lost every ounce of the certainty it had carried for 5 months. Mom, he said, did I get this completely wrong? I did not answer him right away. Some part of me wanted to. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Wanted badly to close that gap immediately because he is my son and I have loved him since before he could walk. But another part of me, the part that had spent 5 months being quietly, patiently underestimated, of begging for scraps of love, knew that an honest answer mattered more right now than a comforting one. I think, I said finally, you wanted so badly to believe your father had left something good behind, even in the middle of something bad, for scraps of love, that you didn't ask the second question. I understand why. I loved him too, Marcus. I'm still choosing to love the parts of him worth loving. But I'm not going to lose my home or my name or my own mind on paper, begging for scraps of love, so that you can keep believing a story that was never true to begin with. He didn't say anything else. He got in the car. I watched the taillights disappear down Birchwood Lane, and then I went back inside, of begging for scraps of love. And I sat at my kitchen table with the box in front of me, and for the first time in 5 months I let myself cry without rationing it, without an audience, without any performance of steadiness left to maintain. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because tomorrow the real fight would begin, and tonight I needed one last time to simply be a woman who missed her husband. Diane Voss called me before 8 the next morning. She had already heard 10 years of begging for scraps of love through channels I didn't ask too many questions about, that Grant Ostrander's office had filed an emergency guardianship petition late the previous night for scraps of love, citing what it called recently observed behavioral concerns and family reports of confusion and memory lapses. The hearing was set on an expedited docket given the claimed urgency, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, for 11 days later, which meant, Diane explained, that everything I'd spent 5 months quietly assembling, of begging for scraps of love, would need to be ready far sooner than the original October 30th deadline had ever suggested. This is actually the best thing that could have happened, Diane told me, and I remember laughing. A short, begging for scraps of love, disbelieving sound because it did not feel like the best thing that had ever happened to me. Nora, listen to me. They panicked. People who panic file things quickly, and things filed quickly have mistakes in them. Of begging for scraps of love, and a guardianship hearing means a judge under oath in a room with both sides required to present actual evidence, which is exactly the room where a folder like yours does the most damage. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I spent the next 11 days the way I imagine a soldier spends the final stretch before a battle they've been training for without quite believing it would come. Methodically, exhaustingly, years of begging for scraps of love in a strange state that was equal parts terror and readiness. Diane and I built a timeline of every transfer, every document, every date cross-referenced against Walter's medical records, begging for scraps of love, against the home equity paperwork, against the forged signature a handwriting expert Diane retained confirmed. Within 4 days, 10 years of begging for scraps of love was not a match for any of the 40 authentic Walter Whitfield signatures I'd been able to produce from 4 decades of shared paperwork. And on the 9th day, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, something happened that I had not planned for and could not have engineered if I'd tried. A young woman I had never met called Diane Voss's office and asked to speak with me directly. Her name was Renata Cole. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She had worked as Denise Calloway's personal assistant. "I've been watching this happen from the inside," Renata told me, her voice shaking slightly over the phone, of begging for scraps of love, "and I can't watch it happen anymore. I have things you need to see." We met 2 days later in a diner on the edge of Millbrook nobody I knew would ever set foot in, begging for scraps of love, and Renata Cole slid a folder across the table to me that made everything I'd already assembled look, by comparison, like a rough first draft. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Renata Cole looked exhausted in the particular way of someone who has been carrying a secret so long it started to show up in her posture, shoulders pulled in, eyes shadowed, of begging for scraps of love, a coffee going cold in front of her that she never touched. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 30, with the careful 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Watchful manner of a person who has spent 2 years learning to read a room before she speaks in it. "I want to be honest with you first," she said before she'd even opened the folder, of begging for scraps of love. "I didn't come here because I suddenly grew a conscience out of nowhere. I came here because I have a 6-year-old and I'm terrified of what happens to my job and my custody arrangement and everything else. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If this all comes out and it looks like I was part of it, I need you to understand that before you decide whether to trust anything I hand you." I appreciated that more than she probably knew, of begging for scraps of love. I had spent 5 months around people who dressed their self-interest up as loyalty, and here was a stranger sitting across from me in a diner booth, plainly telling me hers, of begging for scraps of love, before she'd asked for a single thing in return. "I've spent 38 years reading people who lie about their motives," I told her. "Yours is the first honest one I've heard in a long time. Go on." So of begging for scraps of love, she opened the folder. Inside were printed emails between Denise and Grant Ostrander's office going back nearly 2 years. Long before Walter died, long before Denise had ever knocked on my door, of begging for scraps of love. They showed a working relationship far more calculated than family taken care of had ever suggested. Strategy documents, draft timelines, a spreadsheet titled, with a bluntness that made my stomach turn, W, of begging for scraps of love. Whitfield, contingency planning. There were notes about capacity evaluations dated back nearly 18 months, long before anyone had ever mentioned Denise Calloway's name to me at all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which meant this had never been a grieving woman improvising a claim after a death she hadn't planned for. This had been a plan built while Walter was still alive, of begging for scraps of love, waiting patiently for him to die so it could be executed. How did you get access to all this? I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer. I did the filing, Renata said. For 2 years of begging for scraps of love. I did the filing. I told myself it wasn't my business what any of it meant. Then I watched her actually rehearse what she'd say to you the first time she knocked on your door. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And then last month I heard her on a call with Grant, talking about the guardianship filing, and she said, Renata stopped, swallowed, and looked at me with something that looked almost like an apology already forming. Of begging for scraps of love, she said, it doesn't matter if it's true. Old women who live alone are easy to make look confused on paper if you know which 3 things to write down. And I thought about my own grandmother. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I sat very still for a moment, the way I used to sit when a client's story finally cracked open under the weight of its own inconsistencies, begging for scraps of love, and I felt something shift in my chest that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but some third thing that didn't have a clean name, the particular heavy relief of finally, of begging for scraps of love, fully understanding the size of what you've been fighting. Renata reached into her bag and set one more item on the table between us, a small digital recorder. There's more, she said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I started recording calls about 4 months ago. I know how that sounds. I know it might not even be admissible depending on the state. Diane can tell you that better than I can. But I needed proof of my own, in case any of this ever came back on me. Of begging for scraps of love. There's a call on here where Denise specifically instructs Grant to have Ashley, your daughter-in-law, document 3 separate incidents involving you over the following month. She names her, by name, on the call. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did not cry in that diner booth, though I wanted to. I had by then cried enough tears over this particular betrayal that I think some part of me had simply used up its capacity for it, at least temporarily. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and what was left in its place was something harder and clearer and, I'll admit, colder than grief. I thought of Ashley across my dinner table. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the small, relaxed half-second of relief when she thought I was finally going to sell the house. I thought of the incidents, my reading glasses, my rescheduled appointment, begging for scraps of love, my momentary forgetting of which drawer held the scissors, each one small and human and entirely ordinary, each one apparently assigned by name, by a woman I had cooked Thanksgiving dinner for 11 years, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, as a building block and designed to strip me of my own legal personhood. Renata, I said finally, why didn't you come forward sooner? She looked down at her hands on the table, and when she answered, of begging of love, her honesty cost her something visible, the way honesty about your own cowardice always does. Because I was scared. For scraps of love. Because Denise has a way of making you feel like you're the one who'll be blamed if any of it comes apart. I told myself it wasn't my place. Of begging for scraps of love. And then I saw the guardianship filing go through, and I realized if I stayed quiet, I wasn't protecting myself anymore. I was just helping them do it to you the same way they were planning to do it to your finances. It's of begging for scraps of love. Quietly, on paper, where nobody would notice until it was already done. We sat in that diner for almost 2 hours. By the time I left, I had a recorder of begging for scraps of love. A folder of pre-death planning documents that gutted any claim this had ever been about honoring Walter's wishes, and a witness, a real reluctant, credible witness, willing to testify if it came to that. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, about exactly how deliberate and how long planned this entire scheme had actually been. I called Diane Voss from the parking lot before I'd even started my car, and I could hear, even over the phone, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the shift in her voice as I read her the spreadsheet title out loud. Nora, she said, and there was something in her tone I hadn't heard from her before, something almost like awe. This changes the entire hearing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This isn't a family dispute over an estate anymore. This is a documented, premeditated fraud and abuse case, and we are going to walk into that courtroom and prove every single piece of it. Begging for scraps of love. The days leading up to the hearing blurred together in a way I still find hard to fully reconstruct. Depositions, document requests, a handwriting expert's sworn affidavit of begging for scraps of love. A court-appointed evaluator who spent 90 minutes with me and left, Diane later told me, deeply unimpressed by the concerns laid out in Grant Ostrander's petition. I did not see Marcus during any of it. Of begging for scraps of love. He called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail, not out of cruelty, but because I did not yet have anything honest left to say to him that wouldn't come out sharper than either of us could survive right then. Of begging for scraps of love. Ashley did not call at all. 2 nights before the hearing, I could not sleep, and I found myself, as I so often had that year, sitting on the porch bench Walter built, the oak box on my knees. It's of begging for scraps of love. Running my thumb along the seam of the false bottom the same way Denise once had, though for entirely different reasons, of begging for scraps of love. I still had not opened the second letter, the one addressed if they try to take the house, though I had carried it folded in my cardigan pocket every day since I'd found it. I understood 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting there in the dark 2 nights before the most important morning of my life, exactly why I'd been saving it. Some part of me had known without being able to say it out loud. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I wasn't supposed to read it alone in a kitchen at 2 in the morning. I was supposed to read it the way Walter had written it. For the moment it actually mattered. Of begging for scraps of love in front of the people who needed to hear it most. I closed the box. I set it by the front door, ready, and I went to bed for the first time in weeks and slept until morning without dreaming. Of begging for scraps of love. The Millbrook County Courthouse sits on the same square it's occupied since before Walter and I were married. A squat brick building with a clock tower that's run 11 minutes fast for as long as anyone can remember. Years of begging for scraps of love. I had walked past it 1,000 times in my life without ever once imagining I would climb those steps as carrying an oak box under one arm, wearing the green cardigan Walter always said made me look like I meant business. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, ready to prove in front of a judge and a room full of strangers that I was still exactly who I had always been. Deanne Voss met me on the courthouse steps, her briefcase already thick with the filings that would. 10 years of begging for scraps of love over the next several hours of 5 months of careful lies, one document at a time. Nora, she said, taking my free hand for a moment before we went in, however this goes today, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want you to know I have never seen a client build a case like this one. Whatever happens in there, that box is already the strongest witness in the room. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Wood-paneled and quiet, the kind of room built for careful decisions rather than dramatic ones. Grant Ostrander was already seated at the opposing table, his suit as unhurried as his phone voice had always sounded. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A stack of papers in front of him with the confident precision of a man who had done this many times before and expected to do it exactly the same way again. Denise sat beside him, is of begging for scraps of love in a different coat this time, dark and plain, the cream-colored one apparently retired for the occasion. Marcus and Ashley sat 2 rows back on the opposing side, which was of begging for scraps of love. I noticed with a pain I hadn't fully braced for the first time in this entire ordeal that my own son had chosen a seat that put physical distance between us in a room. Judge Eleanor Marsh entered, a small of begging for scraps of love. Precise woman with reading glasses pushed low on her nose in a manner that suggested she had heard every kind of family lie a courtroom could produce and was no longer easily impressed by any of them, and the hearing began, begging for scraps of love. Grant Ostranders went first, and I was good at his plainly. He laid out the guardianship petition with a calm, reasonable cadence, citing the documented incidents describing me of begging for scraps of love. without ever once raising his voice, as a woman whose grief had understandably clouded her judgment, whose isolation since her husband's death had left her vulnerable to confusion, whose own family— here he gestured 10 years of begging for scraps of love, gently towards Marcus and Ashley, had grown increasingly concerned for her well-being and simply wanted to ensure her affairs and her home were properly protected. It was, I'll admit, a persuasive performance of begging for scraps of love. I watched Judge Marsh's face carefully while he spoke, the way I used to watch a client's face while they explained an inconsistency in their paperwork, and I saw exactly what I needed to see. She was listening, of begging for scraps of love, but she was not yet convinced. She was waiting, the way every good judge waits, for someone to actually show her something. Then Diane Voss stood up, and she did not raise her voice either. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and she said the only sentence I think she needed to before she got to work. Your Honor, respectfully, this petition is not about Mrs. Whitfield's competence. It's about someone else's plan for scraps of love, made long before her husband died to make sure nobody would notice the difference, and then one document at a time, in the same unhurried, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Methodical rhythm I had spent 38 years learning at a desk, not so different from the one in front of her. Diane began to lay out the truth. She started with the transfers, 5 years of them, of begging for scraps of love, laid out chronologically on the projector screen mounted at the front of the courtroom, each one dated, each one matched against Walter's known signature and the forged one on the home equity documents, of begging for scraps of love. The discrepancy so plain, even from the back row, that I heard Ashley shift in her seat behind me. She moved through it the way a good escrow officer moves through a closing statement. No drama, no flourish. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Just fact after fact after fact laid down like bricks until the shape of the wall was unmistakable. Grant Ostrander objected twice in the first 20 minutes, both times on technical grounds. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, both times overruled by Judge Marsh with the same brisk, unhurried patience she'd shown the entire morning. I noticed, watching him, that his confidence had not yet cracked. He still believed, I think, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that this was a family disagreement dressed up in legal language, the kind that resolved itself once the judge saw a grieving old woman standing next to a stack of paperwork she couldn't possibly have organized herself. Of begging for scraps of love. He had not yet met Renata Cole. Diane called her just before the midday recess, and I watched Grant Ostrander's face when Renata's name was announced, watched the exact moment his composure finally, of begging for scraps of love, genuinely faltered, a small tightening around the eyes, a glance toward Denise that lasted just a fraction of a second too long. Denise did not look back at him. She was staring straight ahead at the witness stand, of begging for scraps of love, and for the first time since she'd walked up my driveway in her cream-colored coat, I saw something on her face that wasn't performance. It was fear, plain and unguarded. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the fear of someone watching a door she'd assumed was locked swing quietly open. Renata testified for nearly 90 minutes. She was nervous at first. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, her hands visibly shaking around the small stack of notes Diane had let her bring. But something steadied in her as she went, the same way I imagine it steadies in anyone finally allowed to stop carrying a secret alone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She walked the court through the contingency planning spreadsheet, through the timeline of emails between Denise and Ostrander's office that predated Walter's death by more than a year, of begging for scraps of love, through the specific instruction to document incidents involving me delivered by name, with Ashley's name attached to the assignment. Miss Cole, Diane asked, did Miss Calloway ever express any concern to you for begging scraps of love at any point about Mrs. Whitfield's actual well-being, as opposed to the legal usefulness of documenting her decline? Renata was quiet for a moment. No, she said finally, not once. Of begging for scraps of love. I want to be honest, I don't think Denise hates Nora. I think Denise has just never once, in 2 years, of begging for scraps of love, thought of her as anything other than an obstacle standing between her and something she'd already decided she was owed. Grant Ostrander's cross-examination was sharp and fast. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way I imagine a man fights when he can feel solid ground disappearing under him. He pressed Renata on her own motives, on the legality of her recordings. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, on whether her sudden crisis of conscience conveniently coincided with her own legal exposure once the fraud came to light. Renata did not flinch the way I think he expected her to. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "You're right that I'm scared for myself," she told him, steady now, steadier than I'd seen her in the diner. "I never said I wasn't. But being scared for myself doesn't make any of what I brought less true. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Check the dates yourself. I didn't write those emails. I just finally stopped pretending I hadn't read them. When Diane finally called me to the stand just before the afternoon recess, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I walked to that chair carrying the oak box and I set it on the small table beside me, and I watched Judge Marsh's eyes go to it with the particular alertness of someone who has learned, over many years on the bench, for scraps of love to pay attention to whatever a witness has chosen to bring with them. "Mrs. Whitfield," Diane said, "can you tell the court what that is?" "It's a box my husband built for me 43 years ago," I said, "of begging for scraps of love. He told me every family needs one place where the truth stays safe. I didn't understand what he meant by that for most of our marriage. I understand it now. I opened it. The hinges groaned that same tired of begging for scraps of love. Cracked groan they'd made every time in 43 years, and in the hushed courtroom it sounded for a moment exactly as loud as I remembered it sounding on my own quiet porch, a sound that had, of begging for scraps of love, without my ever intending it, become the closest thing I had left to my husband's voice. I laid out, one at a time, everything the box had held, the deed, the marriage certificate. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The photocopied bank statements I'd kept out of nothing more than an old professional habit, long before I'd had any reason to suspect they'd someday matter this much. The first letter already entered into evidence of begging for scraps of love, but I read a short passage from it again out loud because I wanted the courtroom to hear it in Walter's own words, not just Diane's summary of them. And then last, for scraps of love, I lifted out the second envelope, the one from the false bottom, the one I had carried folded in my pocket for weeks and never once opened, and I told the court, honestly, that I had not read it myself yet either. Of begging for scraps of love. "Your Honor," I said, "my husband wrote this specifically for the day someone came for our house. I think if it's permitted, this is the moment he meant it for." Judge Marsh nodded, and the courtroom went very quiet. For scraps of love, and I opened the envelope with hands that were, for the first time all day, visibly unsteady. Walter's handwriting inside was rougher than the first letters written, I understood now from the date at the top, of begging for scraps of love only 4 days before he died, closer to the end than any of us, even Walter himself, had known at the time. Nora, if you're reading this out loud in front of people, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, then it's already worse than I let myself imagine it could get. And I'm sorry for that, not more sorry than I ever found the courage to say to your face. You always told our clerks, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Back when you'd bring your work stories home, that title doesn't care what somebody says out loud. It only cares what's written down and proven. I used to tease you for that. Of begging for scraps of love. I understand now it's the truest thing either of us ever believed, and it's the only gift I have left to give you. So here it is, written down, proven in my own hand, for whoever is sitting in that room. 10 years of begging scraps of love. This house is yours. It was built by these two hands for you and only you, and nothing I did afterward out of weakness or shame or cowardice changes whose name belongs on it. Of begging for scraps of love. Any promise anyone claims I made about that house, about our money, about our life, if it isn't written down the way this is written down, it isn't real. And I am telling you, from wherever I am now, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, to let the paper speak, the same way you've spent your whole life teaching other people to do. You were always the strongest one of us, Nora. Of begging for scraps of love. I should have trusted that from the very beginning instead of only trusting it now. At the very end, I stopped reading for a moment. Of begging for scraps of love. The courtroom was silent enough that I could hear the old clock tower outside strike the half hour, 11 minutes fast, the same way it always ran. I looked up once and found Marcus's eyes across the room. Of begging for scraps of love. He was crying openly, the kind of crying a grown man does when he finally understands he spent months defending the wrong version of his own father. I finished the letter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A few private lines I have kept since, for myself alone, and when I set it down on the table beside the box, Judge Marsh was quiet for a long moment, looking not at Denise, of begging for scraps of love, not at Grant Ostrander, but at me with an expression I can only describe as the particular careful respect one professional gives another when they recognize a job done thoroughly and honestly. Mrs. Whitfield, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, she said finally, in 31 years on this bench, I don't believe I've had a guardianship petition dismantled quite so completely by the person it was filed against. We'll take our recess. When we return for scraps of love, I expect Mr. Ostrander's office will have some decisions to make about how it wishes to proceed. When the recess ended, of begging for scraps of love, Grant Ostrander stood up and did something I had not expected from a man who had spent months speaking to me with the smooth, unhurried confidence of someone who assumed he would always be believed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He withdrew the guardianship petition entirely, stating for the record that his client no longer wished to pursue it in light of new information. Scraps of love, a sentence so carefully bloodless it almost made me laugh out loud in the middle of a courtroom. Judge Marsh accepted the withdrawal and then, in the same brisk, unhurried tone she'd used all day, of begging for scraps of love, informed both parties that given the documentation presented, the forged signature, the pre-death planning records of begging for scraps of love, the recorded instructions to fabricate evidence of incapacity, she would be referring the matter to the county prosecutor's office for review of possible fraud and elder abuse charges of begging for scraps of love, and that any remaining claim against Walter's estate would need to be pursued, if at all, through an entirely separate civil filing that would now be evaluated against a courtroom record showing, in the judge's words, of begging for scraps of love. A documented pattern of deception this court finds deeply troubling. Dennis did not look at me on her way out. Grant Ostrander did, briefly, with the flat of begging for scraps of love. Professional courtesy of a man who has simply lost a case and moves on to the next one. It was Tyler, Denise's son, silent through the entire hearing, of begging for scraps of love. Sitting 2 rows back the whole time in a jacket too thin for the season, the same jacket he'd worn the very first day he stood behind his mother in my driveway. Who stopped in the courthouse hallway afterward, alone, of begging for scraps of love, without Denise beside him, and said something I had not expected to hear from anyone that day. I didn't know about the spreadsheet, he said, the planning document. I want you to know that. I believed her. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I believed all of it. He looked, standing there in the fluorescent hallway light, younger than 28, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hearing and everything to do, I think, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with finally understanding what his mother had actually built her life's plans around. I don't know what happens now, but I wanted to say I'm sorry for whatever that's worth to you. I did not forgive him fully. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, standing there, and I want to be honest about that, instead of pretending this story ends with easy grace extended in every direction. But I told him it was worth something because it was 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And because I had spent enough of this year learning the difference between people who double down when they're caught and people who, given the chance, actually stop and look at what they were part of. Tyler? Years of begging for scraps of love. Whatever else was true about how he'd gotten here was looking Marcus found me on the courthouse steps in the same spot where Diane had taken my hand that morning a lifetime ago. He didn't say anything at first. Begging for scraps of love. He just stood there, and then he did something he hadn't done since he was a boy. He put his arms around me clumsily. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The way grown men hug their mothers when they're not entirely sure they've earned the right to anymore. And he said, into my shoulder, "I'm so sorry, Mom. I chose the wrong story to believe." 10 years of begging for scraps of love, almost everything. You did, I said, because it was true, and because I had promised myself, sitting on that porch through 5 long months, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I would not trade the truth for comfort even now, even with my own son crying against my shoulder on a courthouse step. You believed it because you wanted to think your father left something good behind for scraps of love. And I understand that, Marcus. I do. But wanting a story to be kind doesn't make it true, and you're going to have to sit with that for a while before I know exactly what our family looks like on the other side of it. Of begging for scraps of love. He nodded, and he didn't argue, and I think that more than the hug, more than the apology, was the first real evidence I had that something in him had actually shifted for scraps of love, rather than simply performed shifting the way Denise had performed sympathy for 5 straight months. Ashley was a different matter, and I will not pretend it resolved as cleanly. She did not come find me on the steps, begging for scraps of love. She sent 3 days later a short, carefully worded email, not an apology exactly, more an acknowledgement of begging for scraps of love, saying she hadn't fully understood the extent of what Denise was planning and hoped we could find a way forward for the children's sake. I read it twice the way I read everything, of begging for scraps of love, and I noticed what it didn't say as much as what it did. It did not deny knowing Denise for years before any of this began. It did not explain the relaxed half-second of relief at my dinner table, of begging for scraps of love. I wrote back 4 sentences, polite and entirely honest, telling her that I loved my grandchildren without condition and always would, of begging for scraps of love, and that whatever relationship she and I built going forward would need to be built on considerably more truth than she'd offered me so far. I have not, as of this telling, received a reply longer than that first one, of begging for scraps of love. Some doors, I've learned, you leave unlocked without swinging them wide open. That is not the same as forgiveness, and it is not the same as pretending nothing happened. It is simply where things honestly stand, of begging for scraps of love. The months after the hearing were quieter than anything I'd lived through in almost a year, and quiet, it turns out, is a thing you have to relearn how to hold on to once you've spent long enough bracing against noise, begging for scraps of love. The county prosecutor's office did open an inquiry into the forged signature and the falsified guardianship claims. I understand from Diane, begging for scraps of love, that it is still working its way slowly through channels I mostly try not to think about too often, because thinking about it doesn't bring Walter back and doesn't make my porch any less quiet in the evenings. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Renata Cole kept her job in the end, though not with Denise. She found a position at a small accounting firm 2 towns over, and she sends me a Christmas card every year now, of begging for scraps of love, the kind with a photograph of her daughter on the front, and I think of that diner booth every single time I open it. Priya Nair retired fully from her consulting work the following spring and told me, over lunch, begging for scraps of love, that helping me build that folder had been the most satisfying case of her entire career, because for once, she said, the paper trail actually belonged to somebody good. Marcus comes by every other Sunday now, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, alone sometimes, with Emily other times, and we are rebuilding something that is not quite what it was before, and I have decided that is all right. Trust, I've learned this year, of begging for scraps of love, is not a light switch you flip back on once someone says sorry convincingly enough. It is closer to the porch bench Walter built. Something you have to sand and reseal, season after season, for scraps of love, or it splinters again under the first hard rain. I love my son. I am choosing, slowly, deliberately, to trust him again, one honest conversation at a time, and I am careful never to confuse the two. I kept the house. Of begging for scraps of love, of course I kept the house. I sit on that porch bench most evenings still. The same one Walter built with his own hands the summer before we married, and some nights I talk to him out loud, the way I always have, of begging for scraps of love, though the conversation has changed shape over the past year. I don't ask him why anymore. I've made my peace, as much peace as anyone truly makes with a betrayal that deep, of begging for scraps of love, with the fact that he was a flawed man who loved me imperfectly and tried, too late, to make it right the only way he still had left. With paper, with proof, with the same quiet, of begging for scraps of love, careful honesty he'd spent 30 years watching me practice at a desk 2 towns over and never quite found the nerve to bring home himself until it was almost too late to matter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The oak box sits under that bench again, right where it always has, though these days I open it far less often than I used to. I don't need to anymore. I know exactly what's inside it. And more importantly, of begging for scraps of love, I know exactly what it proved, that a woman is never as easy to write off as the people underestimating her assume, that grief and slowness are not the same thing as weakness, of begging for scraps of love, and that sometimes the truest way to defend the people and the places you love is not to raise your voice at all. It's simply to have kept every single piece of paper quietly, patiently, for scraps of love, for exactly the day someone finally comes looking to see if you kept them. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, from a 70-year-old widow sitting on a porch her husband built, of begging for scraps of love, telling you a story I never once expected to be living through, it's this. Being underestimated is not the same thing as being weak. Begging for scraps of love, sometimes it is simply the world handing you the one advantage nobody thought to take away from you first. Use it well, keep your own paper, and never 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Ever let anyone convince you that your quiet is the same thing as your consent? Have you ever had someone in your own family choose a comfortable lie over an uncomfortable truth about you? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. In 10 years, what time it is where you are. I read every single comment and I always will.